Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something that probably occupies a good chunk of your brain space every single day. Something absolutely fundamental to your existence. Food. Specifically, medieval food. Now, I know what you're probably picturing. You're thinking of those big, lavish feasts you see in movies. Turkeys the size of small dogs, roasted boars with apples in their mouths, chalices of wine, tables groaning under the weight of plenty. Knights and ladies in fine clothes, laughing, probably juggling a bit, definitely not worried about their next meal. Let me stop you right there. Forget that image. Seriously, erase it. Take a mental eraser and just go shoop across that Hollywood banquet table. Because the reality of food in the Middle Ages for the vast majority of people was nothing like that. It was, in a word, disgusting. Like, truly, fundamentally, often dangerously disgusting. And tonight, we're going to dive deep into why. We're going to explore the grim, gritty, and often stomach-churning truth about what people actually ate, how they prepared it, and why it would likely make you gag, possibly vomit, and probably get very, very sick. So, before you get too comfortable, maybe finish that perfectly safe, nutritionally balanced, hygienically prepared snack you have. Because by the time we're done, you're going to look at your refrigerator with a newfound, almost religious reverence. Let's dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get ready, because we're about to take a culinary journey, and it's not going to be pleasant. Welcome to the age of truly repulsive meals. To understand why medieval food was so often disgusting, you first have to understand the world it existed in. This wasn't a world of supermarkets and refrigerators and food safety standards overseen by government agencies. This was a world where life was hard, precarious, and dominated by the relentless, unyielding cycles of nature and the crushing weight of social hierarchy. Most people were peasants, bound to the land, living subsistence lives. Their entire existence revolved around agriculture. And agriculture in the Middle Ages was challenging. Yields were low. Pests were rampant. The weather was unpredictable. A bad harvest didn't mean slightly higher prices at the grocery store. It meant potential starvation. And even when there was food, the challenges had just begun. How do you keep it from spoiling? How do you protect it from rats and mice and weevils and flies? How do you prepare it safely when you have no running water, limited fuel, and absolutely zero understanding of bacteria? The answer usually was you didn't. Or you did the best you could with incredibly limited, often horrifying, resources. The bedrock of the medieval diet, for virtually everyone, was grain. Mostly wheat, barley, rye, oats, or a mix. This grain was turned into two main things, bread and pottage. Sounds simple enough, right? Bread and soup. Wholesome, earthy, rustic. Wrong. Let's start with the bread. Your modern loaf, soft, airy, consistent, is a miracle of modern agriculture and milling. Medieval bread was different. First, the grain itself was often contaminated. Harvest methods were basic, and the grain was frequently stored in damp, pest-infested conditions. Weevils, rodents, mold, they were all part of the package. When you ground the grain, guess what got ground up with it? Yep, insect parts, rodent droppings, dirt, stones. Peasant bread, often made from rye or barley, was heavy, dense, and dark. It was frequently mixed with other things to stretch the flour, ground peas, beans, even acorns, or chaff. This wasn't about flavor, it was about survival, getting enough calories however they came. And the grinding itself was an issue. Milling stones were rough, and fragments of stone often ended up in the flour. Eating medieval bread wasn't just chewing, it was a slow process of grinding down your teeth on grit and stone fragments. This is clearly visible in the wear patterns on medieval skeletons' teeth. Imagine the constant toothaches, the broken teeth, all from your daily bread. But the truly disgusting part wasn't just the grit or the potential insect protein. It was the mold. Rye, in particular, is susceptible to a fungus called ergot. Ergot contains potent toxins, including precursors to LSD. Eating ergot-contaminated bread caused a terrifying illness known as St. Anthony's fire or ergotism. Imagine this. You eat your dark, heavy, gritty bread. A few hours later, you start feeling a burning sensation in your limbs. It intensifies. Your hands and feet feel like they're on fire. Then come the hallucinations. Distorted visions, psychotic episodes. In the worst cases, the blood supply to your extremities is cut off, causing gangrene. Your fingers, your toes, your hands, your feet literally rot and fall off while you're still alive, screaming, tormented by visions. All from your bread, your daily bread. And even without ergot, mold was a constant issue. Grain got damp. Bread didn't last long before going stale and fuzzy. You might try to scrape off the worst of the mold, but the fungal spores were throughout. Eating moldy bread wasn't an occasional mistake. It was often just what you ate, because throwing it away meant going hungry. Now pottage, the medieval staple stew. This was usually a thick porridge or soup made by boiling grain or vegetables in water, milk, or weak ale. It was cooked in a single pot, often hanging over the fire, and ingredients were added over days. Think of it as a never-ending stew. You'd cook some pottage today, eat some, leave the rest in the pot. Tomorrow, you add more water, maybe some scraps of whatever you found, a few leeks, a turnip, a bone with a bit of gristle still clinging to it. You boil it up again. The stuff from yesterday, the day before, it's all still in there. Reheated, but not necessarily brought to a rolling, sterilizing boil for long periods. What went into the pottage? For the poor, it was whatever they could forage or grow. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, peas, beans, barley, oats. If they were lucky, maybe a bit of fat or bone. The vegetables weren't washed, not properly anyway. The water sources were often contaminated. Rivers and streams used for drinking, washing clothes, and disposing of waste. Wells could be shallow and easily polluted by surface runoff or nearby privies. So, you're adding vegetables rinsed, if at all, in water potentially laden with human and animal waste. The pot itself was rarely, if ever, truly cleaned. Imagine centuries of boiled-on residue, burnt bits, and whatever creepy crawlies decided to take a dip when the fire was low. The flavor profile was probably complex, dominated by smoke, rancid fat, if you had any, and whatever was just starting to turn in the bottom of the pot. And because it was a continuous stew, bacteria had a field day in between heatings. Every batch of pottage was a microbial lucky dip. Would you get a bit of sustenance? Or a raging case of the trots that could potentially kill you through dehydration? You didn't know until it was too late. Meat. Meat. The stuff of those Hollywood feasts. For most medieval people, meat was a rare luxury. If you were a peasant, you might keep a few chickens, maybe a pig. But these were valuable assets. The chickens provided eggs. The pig was an investment, ideally slaughtered in the autumn to provide salted meat for the winter. Eating your pig wasn't a casual decision. It was a major event, and when you did slaughter it, absolutely nothing was wasted. You weren't just eating the chops and the bacon. You were eating the snout, the ears, the trotter's feet, the organs, liver, kidneys, heart, lungs, tripe, stomach lining, intestines. The blood was collected to make blood puddings or used as a thickener. Again, none of these things are inherently disgusting if prepared properly and hygienically. Modern cuisine in many parts of the world utilizes these parts. But consider the conditions: the lack of refrigeration, the primitive slaughter methods, the potential for parasites and disease within the animal itself, which wouldn't be detected. Imagine butchering a pig in a small, dirt-floored cottage, surrounded by flies and dirt, with only basic, probably not very clean knives. The meat had to be processed immediately. If you weren't going to eat it fresh, which was rare, you had to preserve it. The most common methods were salting, drying, and smoking. Salting involved packing the meat in huge amounts of salt, drawing out moisture. This worked, to a degree, but it left the meat incredibly tough and salty, requiring long soaking and boiling before it was even remotely edible. And if the salt didn't penetrate properly, or the meat wasn't completely covered, pockets of putrefaction could develop. So you'd be chewing on this incredibly tough, salty meat, hoping you didn't hit a pocket of rot that tasted, well, let's just say distinctive. Drying meat, jerky, essentially, was another option, but again, environmental conditions were key. Humidity, insects, dust, all could ruin the drying process and render the meat inedible or dangerous. Smoking added flavor and preservation, but the smoke itself could impart bitter, acrid tastes if not done correctly. But what if you didn't have your own animals? What if you were desperate? This is where things get truly grim. For the very poor, in times of scarcity, anything was potentially food. And I mean anything. Roadkill, animals that died of disease, scraps salvaged from garbage heaps, rats, mice, stray dogs, and cats. We're talking about eating things that are not only unappetizing, but actively dangerous, crawling with parasites and pathogens. And even for those slightly better off, the standards were different. A nobleman might eat more meat than a peasant, but his meat was still likely to be tough, overly salted or spiced, and potentially spoiled. Spices like pepper, ginger, cloves, and cinnamon were incredibly expensive imports, used less for nuanced flavor profiles and more to simply mask the taste and smell of meat that was on the turn. If your stew tasted overwhelmingly of pepper and cloves, you might not notice the subtle tang of putrefaction underneath. It was the ultimate culinary cover-up. Think about that. The height of sophisticated medieval cooking, the use of exotic spices, was often primarily a way to make rotting meat palatable. Fish was also a major part of the medieval diet, especially with the church's rules about not eating meat on Fridays and during Lent. If you live near the coast or a river, you might get fresh fish sometimes. But inland or outside of fishing season, you ate preserved fish. Stockfish was popular, cod or similar white fish, dried until it was literally as hard as wood. You had to beat it with a hammer or mallet for ages to tenderize it before you could even attempt to soak and boil it into something you could chew. It tasted fishy, intensely, powerfully fishy, and dried. Salted herring was another staple. Herring, a small, oily fish packed in barrels of salt. Like the salted meat, it was incredibly salty and required soaking. But the oiliness meant it could go rancid even with salt. The smell of salted herring was apparently pervasive in medieval towns, a pungent aroma of brine and decaying fish oil. Delicious. Beyond the staples of grain, meat, and fish, what about vegetables and fruits? They were eaten seasonally. Cabbages, onions, leeks, turnips, parsnips, beans, peas were common. Apples, pears, plums, berries when in season. But storage was a huge problem. No refrigeration meant fresh produce was only available for a short window. Root vegetables could be stored in cellars or buried, but they were susceptible to rot and pests. Cabbages could be made into sauerkraut, a form of preservation, which is nutritious but has a strong, distinctive flavor. Fruits were often eaten raw, which, given the state of water and soil contamination, was risky, or they were dried or preserved in honey or verjuice, a sour liquid made from unripe grapes or crab apples. Sugary preserves were usually a treat for the wealthy. Again, the preparation hygiene was minimal. Vegetables pulled from potentially contaminated soil, rinsed, maybe, in contaminated water, chopped on dirty surfaces with dirty knives. The chances of ingesting parasites or bacteria were sky high. Dairy was another source of food, primarily milk, cheese, and butter. Milk, of course, goes off very quickly without refrigeration. So, milk was either consumed immediately or processed into cheese and butter, which lasts longer. Medieval cheese making was a far cry from modern sterile dairies. Raw milk, often from animals living in close proximity to their own waste, was used. Rennet, often derived from animal stomachs, was added, the curds separated from the whey. The curds were pressed and aged. The conditions for aging cheese were rarely controlled for temperature or humidity. Mold was inevitable, not always the desirable kind. Insect infestation was common. Medieval cheese was often hard, strongly flavored, not always in a good way, and might contain unwelcome protein in the form of maggots or other insect larvae. Butter could be preserved by salting, but rancidity was a constant threat. Rancid butter doesn't just taste bad, It contains compounds that can make you sick. And medieval butter, stored in crocks, often without airtight seals, was probably rancid more often than it was fresh. Now let's talk about drinks, because you couldn't just drink the water. As mentioned, water sources were generally polluted. Rivers, streams, wells, they were convenient stores for every kind of nasty microbe. Drinking raw water was a fast track to dysentery or other waterborne illnesses. So, people drank alcohol, not to get drunk all the time, though that happened, but because the fermentation process killed some of the worst pathogens. Weak ale or beer was a daily drink for everyone, including children. Cider was common where apples were grown. Wine was for the wealthy, often diluted. But medieval brewing and fermenting weren't exact sciences. Sanitation was poor. The vats and barrels used could harbor bacteria and yeast that resulted in sour, vinegary, or just plain foul-tasting drinks. Contamination could still happen, leading to illness. And the alcoholic content was often low, meaning it wasn't a foolproof sterilizer anyway. You were essentially choosing between risky water and potentially sour, weak, slightly safer alcohol. Think about the sheer lack of options and the constant, low-grade fear surrounding food. Every meal was a gamble. Would it provide sustenance, or sickness, or death? And the taste, the sheer, overwhelming unpleasantness of many medieval foods. The grit in the bread, the pervasive saltiness of preserved meats and fish, the rancidity of fats, the sourness of poorly fermented drinks, the strong, sometimes off flavors of poorly stored vegetables and cheese. Add to this the ever-present possibility of finding a maggot or a piece of rodent dropping in your food. It wasn't just poverty, it was also the fundamental lack of scientific understanding about decay and disease. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know that washing your hands before preparing food was crucial. They didn't know that boiling water thoroughly made it safe to drink. Their explanations for illness were often rooted in superstition, humors, the body's fluids, or divine displeasure, not the simple fact that the food they ate was crawling with microscopic life that was actively trying to kill them. Imagine a medieval kitchen, not the gleaming, stainless steel palace you might see today. No, imagine a smoky, dimly lit room, a dirt floor, or maybe packed earth, animals wandering in and out, chickens, maybe a dog or cat, flies buzzing around open food, food scraps left out attracting rodents, a single pot hanging over an open fire, utensils made of wood, which is porous and hard to clean, or perhaps some hammered metal. Washing up, it was a cursory rinse, maybe, no soap as we know it, just scraping off the worst of the visible grime. The wooden trenchers, plates, or bowls would absorb grease and residues, becoming potent breeding grounds for bacteria. Knives would be wiped, but not sterilized. Food was stored in sacks or barrels or crocks, vulnerable to pests, moisture, and temperature fluctuations. Cellars were damp and often shared with livestock or served as primitive waste disposal sites. Pantries might be slightly better, but still open to the elements and vermin. Every step of the food chain, from field to table, was fraught with opportunities for contamination and degradation. The grain harvested with dirt and stones. The meat slaughtered and preserved without sanitation. The vegetables unwashed. The water impure. The cooking vessels and utensils unclean. The storage facilities infested. It's a wonder anyone survived at all. And, statistically, many didn't, with foodborne illnesses being a constant threat, especially to the young and the old. So, you've woken up in your straw-filled hovel. Congratulations, you're a medieval peasant. You're probably hungry. You haven't eaten anything substantial since yesterday's thin pottage. Your breakfast is likely more pottage, reheated from the day before, or a chunk of that hard, gray bread. You dip the bread in the pottage to soften it. As you chew, you feel the familiar grit between your teeth. You taste the faint, lingering sourness of whatever started to ferment in the pot overnight. Maybe you notice a weevil scurry across the piece of bread you're holding. You brush it off, or maybe you just eat it for the extra protein. You wash it down with weak ale that tastes vaguely of mud and yeast. Lunch, if you get one, might be more bread, Maybe some cheese that smells suspiciously strong and has a few tiny white things crawling on the surface. Or perhaps a handful of raw peas or beans, pulled from the vine and eaten dirt and all. Dinner is the main meal. More pottage, perhaps with a precious small piece of salted meat or dried fish that you had to soak for hours first. The meat is tough, overwhelmingly salty, and has a lingering, slightly off aftertaste that no amount of boiling could completely remove. The fish is like chewing on briny leather. You're constantly hungry, or at best, only temporarily sated by a mass of poorly digestible carbohydrates. Your body craves nutrients it isn't getting. You're probably deficient in vitamins and minerals. Your immune system is constantly battling low-grade infections from the food you're eating. This wasn't an occasional bad meal. This was every day. Every single meal was a negotiation with filth, spoilage, and potential illness. The taste wasn't just unpleasant. It was a constant, visceral reminder of your poverty and vulnerability. And this wasn't just a peasant problem. Even the wealthy, with their access to meat and spices and fine wines, faced issues. Their food might have been more abundant and varied, but the underlying problems of preservation and hygiene remained. Their cooks didn't understand germ theory any better than a peasant did. Their kitchens, while larger, were still susceptible to pests and contamination. Their reliance on spices to mask spoilage meant they were still eating food that was potentially dangerous, just with a more expensive flavor profile. Gout was common among the wealthy, directly linked to their excessive consumption of rich, often questionably sourced foods. So, what were some of the absolute worst things you might have encountered? Beyond the daily grime, well, consider the practicality of, say, preparing livestock. If you slaughter an animal, you have to process it quickly. Sometimes, this meant cooking parts of it while they were still very fresh. Accounts suggest that sometimes organs or other perishable parts were cooked and eaten within hours of slaughter in conditions that were far from sanitary. Think about the concept of waste. In a world of scarcity, there was very little true waste. Anything that could provide calories, however unappetizing or dangerous, was considered. This included things like animal entrails that weren't properly cleaned, or even sometimes the contents of animal stomachs, especially in times of famine. I don't need to elaborate on why that's disgusting and dangerous, do I? And then there are the less common, but still possible ingredients born of desperation. Eating leather, boiling bones for hours to extract meager nutrients, consuming wild plants or fungi that might be poisonous because you were simply too hungry to care about the risk. The line between food and not food blurred significantly when your alternative was starvation. It's easy to look back with modern sensibilities and just feel revulsion. And yes, a lot of it is genuinely revolting by our standards. But it's crucial to remember why they ate these things. They weren't choosing to eat grit-filled, potentially moldy bread or rancid meat because they prefer the taste. They ate it because it was the only thing available that offered a chance, however slim, of survival. Their senses were probably dulled, too. Living in a world of pervasive odors, animal waste, unwashed bodies, smoky fires, rotting garbage, badly tanned leather, rancid food, meant their threshold for bad smells and bad taste was likely much higher than ours. What would make you recoil in horror was just the background noise of existence for them. The constant exposure to low-level pathogens through their food also meant they were frequently unwell. Chronic digestive issues, parasitic infections, skin problems stemming from nutritional deficiencies. These were normal parts of life. They didn't connect it to their diet in the way we would. They might attribute illness to bad air or imbalances in their humors or a curse. The psychological impact of this constant state of being slightly poisoned, of never feeling truly clean or well-nourished, must have been immense. It would have been a pervasive background anxiety. The relief of a good harvest wasn't just about having enough food. It was about having food that might be slightly less likely to make you violently ill. The class divide in food was stark, and it wasn't just about quantity or variety. It was about the type of disgusting you ate. The peasant's disgusting was grit, mold, weevils, rancid fat, thin pottage, root vegetables, and the occasional bit of possibly diseased roadkill born of pure necessity. Their suffering was from chronic malnutrition, parasites, and outright food poisoning from bacterial contamination. The nobles' disgusting was overspiced, oversalted, tough, potentially still spoiled meat hidden under layers of expensive flavorings, rich sauces made with questionable ingredients, and drinks like wine that could contain lead from the vessels they were stored in. Their suffering included gout, kidney stones, and other ailments of excess and subtle poisoning. Neither group was eating what we would consider a healthy, safe, or even consistently palatable diet. The difference was that the nobles' diet might kill them slowly through excess and heavy metals, while the peasants' diet was a daily tightrope walk between starvation and acute, infectious death. This fundamental reality of food shaped everything about medieval life. It dictated settlement patterns. Where was there good land, good water? It drove economic systems, the grain trade, the spice trade. It fueled social unrest. Food shortages were a primary cause of peasant revolts. It limited population growth. Malnutrition weakened people and made them susceptible to disease. Understanding medieval food isn't just a quirky historical footnote. It's a crucial lens through which to view the entire era. It strips away the romanticized notions of brave knights and fair maidens and opulent castles and reminds you that before any of that, there was the simple, brutal need to survive and a struggle to find something, anything, to eat that wouldn't kill you. The lack of control they had over their most basic necessity is striking. They were utterly at the mercy of the harvest, the weather, the pests, and their own profound ignorance about hygiene and disease. It puts into perspective just how precarious life was, even in times of relative peace and plenty. Consider the psychological effect of never experiencing truly clean, fresh, consistently delicious food, of knowing deep down that what you were putting into your body was often compromised, impure, potentially harmful. What does that do to your relationship with food? With your own body? With the world around you? It must have bred a deep fatalism, a resignation to the fact that suffering, including suffering caused by the very act of staying alive, was simply the human condition. And it makes you appreciate, on a level you might not have before, the absolute luxury of modern food safety. The fact that you can go to a store and buy food with a reasonable expectation that it won't contain stones, insect larvae, or deadly toxins. The fact that you can drink water straight from the tap in many places without fear of immediate, violent illness. The fact that refrigeration exists, stopping decay in its tracks. These aren't small conveniences. They are revolutionary changes that have fundamentally altered human life, freeing us from the daily grind of worrying if our next meal is going to be safe, let alone palatable. So tonight, when you finish watching this, and you walk to your kitchen, and you open that refrigerator door, or you fill a glass with clean water from your tap, take a moment, just a single moment, and think about the grit in the bread, the smell of rancid fat, the taste of sour pottage boiled in a never-clean pot, the burning agony of St. Anthony's fire, the constant ache of hunger mixed with the fear of poisoned sustenance. Think about what it meant for food, the thing that is supposed to nourish and sustain you, to be a constant source of danger and disgust. The Middle Ages were fascinating, complex, and in many ways utterly brutal. And nowhere is that brutality clearer than on the dinner table. Or, more accurately, in the shared wooden trencher of gray, gritty pottage. Forget the feasts. Remember the filth. That was the taste of everyday medieval life for most. And that, perhaps more than castles or crowns, is the real, unvarnished history. So tonight, you've journeyed into the less than appetizing world of medieval food. You've hopefully gained a new perspective, perhaps a slightly queasy one, on the daily realities faced by people centuries ago. This wasn't just about having boring food. It was about a fundamental fight for survival waged with every bite. We often romanticize the past, imposing our modern ideals and conveniences onto historical periods. But the simple truth is, the past was harder, smellier, and significantly more likely to give you worms. Food is a perfect microcosm of that reality. It highlights the massive technological leaps we've made in agriculture, preservation, sanitation, and public health that we now take for granted. Think about the sheer amount of human effort and ingenuity developed over centuries that goes into ensuring that the apple you buy at the store is clean, the meat is safe, and the bread is just bread, without added gravel or hallucinogenic fungus. It's a collective achievement built on scientific understanding that medieval people simply didn't possess. Their relationship with food was one of desperate necessity. It wasn't about culinary delight or varied nutrition. It was about staving off the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs for another day. The psychological burden of this must have been crushing. To be constantly reminded of your low place in the world, your vulnerability, your lack of control, simply by looking at your plate. Consider the emotional landscape surrounding meals. For the poor, it was likely a mix of relief at having something to eat, resignation to its unpleasantness, and perhaps anxiety about whether it would cause sickness. For the wealthy, while they had more abundance, the underlying risks remained, and the pressure to display wealth through elaborate, spice-laden meals probably outweighed considerations of genuine palatability or health in our modern sense. The very concept of disgusting is, to some extent, culturally relative. But when we talk about medieval food being disgusting, we're not just talking about things like eating organ meats, which are still eaten today in many cuisines. We're talking about food that was demonstrably, objectively unsafe, contaminated with pathogens and parasites, adulterated with non-food items, and consumed in a state of significant decay. That crosses cultural lines from unusual to harmful. The medieval diet, particularly for the poor majority, was also incredibly monotonous. Day in, day out, the same gray pottage, the same hard bread, the same limited range of vegetables or salted fish. This lack of variety contributed to nutritional deficiencies, but it also must have been soul-crushing in its sameness. Imagine eating essentially the same few things, prepared the same basic, unappetizing ways, every single meal, year after year. The sheer lack of culinary joy, of anticipation for a delicious meal, was another layer of hardship. Even religious observances impacted the diet in ways that might seem challenging today. Fast days, when meat was forbidden, meant relying on fish, often the tough, salty, dried varieties we discussed, and vegetable-based meals. While intended as spiritual discipline, these fasts often coincided with periods of scarcity and limited options anyway, reinforcing the monotony and lack of appeal. The scarcity also led to innovative, if often desperate, methods of stretching food. We talked about mixing grain with other things for bread. Think about the various gruels, porridges, and thin soups made from the absolute minimum of ingredients, boiled to a watery consistency just to make it seem like there was more. Every calorie counted, no matter how diluted or unappetizing its form. The widespread issue of adulteration wasn't just about quantity. It was sometimes deliberate deception. Millers might cheat by adding non-grain fillers to flour. Bakers might mix in cheaper, less nutritious ingredients. There were regulations against this and punishment for getting caught, but in a world where oversight was difficult and survival was paramount, cheating happened. You might be eating bread that was not only gritty and potentially moldy, but also contained chalk or plaster or other things you absolutely do not want in your digestive system. Consider the journey of food from the field to your mouth in the Middle Ages. It was touched by countless hands, exposed to every environmental hazard imaginable, processed with tools that were difficult to clean, and stored in conditions that actively encouraged spoilage and infestation. There were no sealed packages, no temperature-controlled trucks, no sterile processing plants. Every step was a potential point of failure, a new opportunity for the food to become less safe, less palatable, and more likely to cause harm. The sheer effort involved in simply procuring and preparing enough food to survive was exhausting. Long hours of back-breaking agricultural labor, followed by the equally arduous task of milling grain, often by hand, or waiting for access to a mill, fetching water, Heavy were from distant or deep sources, gathering fuel for the fire, and then the slow, smoky process of cooking, often for hours, just to make tough, low-quality ingredients remotely edible. Food wasn't just something you ate. It was a project, a constant, demanding chore. And the psychological toll of this constant effort yielding such meager, unappetizing, and dangerous results must have been profoundly demoralizing. It was a world where your best efforts still resulted in a diet that by modern standards is barely fit for consumption. It wasn't until significant advancements in agriculture, better tools, crop rotation, preservation, canning, later refrigeration, sanitation, understanding germ theory, public health initiatives, and transportation that the average person began to gain reliable access to food that was consistently safe, nutritious, and varied. These changes didn't happen overnight. They were the result of centuries of slow progress, scientific discovery, and societal change. The medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, saw some changes in diet, particularly with the introduction of new crops or improved techniques over time. But for the majority of the population, the fundamental challenges of poverty, preservation, and hygiene remained largely consistent, defining their culinary reality for 1,000 years. So, when you read about medieval history, try to picture the people not just in terms of their clothing or their castles or their battles, but in terms of their daily, visceral experience. Picture the taste in their mouths, the dull ache in their stomachs, the fear of illness with every meal, the sheer, overwhelming unpleasantness of the food that was supposed to sustain them. It's a perspective that is often overlooked in more romanticized accounts, but it is absolutely essential to grasping the true harshness and resilience of medieval life. They didn't just survive, they endured this constant low-grade assault on their senses and their health every single day, just to keep going. The human body is remarkably adaptable, of course. Medieval people developed some level of tolerance to the microbes in their local environment. Their immune systems were constantly challenged. But this came at a cost. Shorter lifespans, chronic illness, and a quality of life that was, by our standards, incredibly low, even down to the most basic act of eating. The difference between our world and theirs isn't just technology. It's a fundamental shift in our ability to control and mitigate the environmental factors that make life difficult and dangerous. Food safety is one of the most profound examples of this shift. It's a reminder that progress, especially in areas like public health and food production, is not inevitable or instantaneous. It's the result of countless discoveries, struggles, and improvements over vast stretches of time. And it's something that is incredibly valuable and worth protecting. So, next time you're complaining about your dinner, or the price of groceries, or the inconvenience of washing dishes, take a deep breath. Remember the grit. Remember the mold. Remember the worms. Remember the St. Anthony's fire. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a new appreciation for the relatively boring, safe, and incredibly accessible food we have today. Because compared to eating through the Middle Ages, pretty much any meal you have tonight is a feast fit for a king. A modern king, that is, who understands the importance of clean water and refrigeration. The medieval diet wasn't just boring or bland. It was a minefield of potential dangers and guaranteed unpleasantness. It was a constant negotiation with decay, contamination, and scarcity. And it shaped the lives and the health of millions. It's a testament to human endurance that they not only survived on such a diet, but built complex societies, created art, and left a legacy that endures. But let's be absolutely clear. That endurance came at a significant cost, paid in sickness, suffering, and a level of daily discomfort that we can only dimly imagine. So, the next time you see a movie depicting a glorious medieval banquet, remember the reality. Remember the peasant scraping grit from their teeth. Remember the noble trying to ignore the faint whiff of decay under a mountain of spices. Remember the child drinking weak, cloudy ale because the water is too dangerous. That's the true taste of the Middle Ages. And it was, for the most part, absolutely disgusting. And on that rather grim note, we wrap up our culinary journey into the medieval stomach. It's a topic that lacks the dramatic battles or political intrigue of other historical subjects, but gets right to the core of what daily life was like for the vast majority of people. It's a history written not in illuminated manuscripts, but in the very real physical suffering and compromised health of the population. It's a history that makes you pause and truly appreciate the fundamental safety and abundance of our modern world, even with all its imperfections. The simple act of having clean water, reliable refrigeration, and food processed with a basic understanding of hygiene represents a monumental leap forward for humanity. We've touched on a lot of unpleasantness tonight, from ergotism to rancid butter to the ever-present grit and grime. This wasn't exhaustive, of course. There are countless other specific examples and regional variations of potentially disgusting medieval foods and practices. But hopefully, it's given you a solid, if slightly nauseating, overview of the general state of affairs. The sheer level of physical discomfort and illness that must have been considered normal is perhaps the hardest thing for us to truly grasp. A persistent stomach ache, periodic bouts of vomiting or diarrhea, skin issues, dull aches and pains, much of this stemming directly from their diet and lack of sanitation. These weren't acute crises all the time, but a chronic low-grade burden that sapped energy and shortened lives. And it all starts with the food they ate. Thank you for joining me on this rather unsavory trip back in time. I hope it was informative, at least, if not exactly pleasant. Remember that historical understanding often requires confronting the uncomfortable truths, peeling back the layers of romanticism to see the difficult realities that shaped the past. And sometimes those realities are quite literally hard to swallow. So, next time you open your fridge or turn on your tap, give a little silent nod of appreciation to the centuries of progress that stand between you and a bowl of questionable pottage boiled in a never-clean pot. It's a small thing, clean and safe food, but it's a massive world-changing thing. And that brings us to the end for tonight. I hope you learned something, perhaps gained a new perspective, and are feeling appropriately grateful for your access to non-lethal snacks. As always, let me know what you thought in the comments below. What surprised or disgusted you the most? Have you ever tried making medieval-style food? And if so, how did you survive? And if you found this deep dive into historical unpleasantness engaging, consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Exploring the often unseen, uncomfortable corners of history is what we do here, and your support helps keep that exploration going. Thank you again for being here. Until next time, try not to think too hard about what might be lurking in your historical pottage. Sleep well and eat safely. You truly are living in a culinary golden age. Good night.